Welcome to Summer Lens. I'm your host, Eva. Last time we talked about how GLP-1 became one of the biggest drug stories in the world, how gut hormone became a drug platform, and how diabetes treatment turned into something much bigger than diabetes. This episode starts off with that. Not in the lab, not in the clinical trial, not in the investor deck, at the pharmacy counter. Imagine a 40-year-old accountant living in Atlanta. She has a BMI of 36, prediabetes, high blood pressure, and a family history of heart disease. She has tried the usual things, diet changes, working more, maybe a structured weight management program. Nothing has worked for long. So she goes to her primary care doctor, having vulnerable conversation about metabolic health. Her doctor decides that a GLP-1 makes sense and sends a prescription for Wegovy to the pharmacy. From a clinical perspective, she's the perfect candidate. The patient has risk factors, the doctor has evidence, the drug exists. But then the pharmacist tells her two things. First, employer-sponsored health insurance copay is going to be $480 per month. And second, they looked at their computer system and say, well, honestly, it doesn't really matter if you can't afford it, because the drug is on back order for at least 3 weeks, maybe even longer. And now the patient has a strange experience. The medicine exists. The doctor prescribed it. The science supports it. But at the actual point of delivery, the whole system just halts. So this accountant, she goes home, frustrated. She opens the laptop, does a quick research, and with 5 minutes finds a telehealth platform. It is offering a compounded version of the exact same active ingredient, and it doesn't cost $480. It costs $249 per month. Plus, she doesn't need to fight with insurance company, and they promise ship straight to the front door in 5 days. So she clicks get started. In the single click, she bypassed the retail pharmacy counter. She bypassed the pharmacy benefit manager, and she bypassed her employer's health plan completely. And this right here, this is a GLP-1 story. The breakthrough didn't end the problem, it moved the problem. For decades, the hard question was scientific. Can we build a medicine that safely changes the biology of obesity and metabolic disease? With GLP-1, the answer increasingly became yes. But once the science worked, a new set of questions appeared. Can manufacturers produce enough supply while insurers cover it? Will employers pay for it? Will PBMs prefer one product over another? Will Medicare treat obesity as a chronic disease or lifestyle category? While patients wait for the system, we'll find another way around it. This is what I want to unpack today. Because GLP-1 did something unusual, it didn't stay inside the normal pharmaceutical channel. A lot of drug launches are important but contained. They move through specialists, peer reviews, formularies, and gradual uptake. But GLP-1 was different. Patients started asking for it by name. Employers started saying it in a pharmacy span. PBMs had to make formulary decisions in real time. And telehealth companies built consumer business around it. Compounding pharmacies stepped into the shortage window, and manufacturers started building direct-to-consumer platforms. Governments also had to revisit older rules about obesity treatment. This became more than a drug launch. It became a system stress testing. And the numbers explain why. Between 2019 and 2024, there was a 587% increase in GLP-1 prescriptions. And by December 2025, these drugs accounted for over 7% of all adult prescriptions in the entire US. Nearly 19.1 million patients taking these medications. The traditional pharmaceutical distribution channel was just never built to handle tens of millions of people suddenly required weekly cold chain stored injectable medication all at once. And population scale demanded changes everything. A GLP-1 receptor agonist is a peptide. It is not a simple chemical compound that you can just synthesize in a massive vat, press into a dry powder tablet, put into a plastic bottle, and leave it on a warehouse shelf for 2 years. It is delicate. Peptides are essentially short chains of amino acids. Biologically, GLP-1 is a hormone that your gut naturally produces when you eat. As discussed in our last episode, it travels to your brain to signal satiety. That's feeling of being full, and it also slows down gastric emptying, so food actually stays in your stomach longer. And because it is this delicate peptide, it degrades if it gets too warm. It has to be manufactured, transported, stored at the pharmacy, and kept in the patient's home under strict temperature controls, usually in a refrigerator. But the real bottleneck is the physical delivery mechanism. You don't swallow it, you inject it. And the manufacturing process for these pens is complex. It is an industry term called sterile fill finish. First, you have to manufacture the active pharmaceutical ingredient, and then you have to perfectly insert that liquid into a sterile glass syringe without any contamination. Then the syringe goes into a plastic auto-injector pen, which has that highly specialized spring mechanism designed so the patient never actually even sees the needle. Every single one of these components has its own separate supply chain. And the sterile assembling requires multi-billion-dollar, highly specialized facilities. Eli Lilly invested $23 billion in manufacturing capacity expansion since 2020. And Novo Nordisk spent roughly $9 billion in 2025 alone just on capacity expansion. But the crazy thing is, despite building factories as fast as physically and legally possible, the demand still completely outpaced them. Tirzepatide, which is the active ingredient in Mounjaro and Zepbound, wasn't officially resolved on the FDA shortage list until December 2024. Semaglutide, which is the Ozempic and Wegovy, that remained on the shortage list through early 2025. During this peak shortage period, 50 of new obesity prescriptions were going unfilled. These prescriptions were unfilled due to the literal absence of physical supply or because of out-of-pocket costs. Because if a patient's insurance denied the claim, the list price at the retail counter was often over $1,300 a month. If you tell tens of millions of people that the scientifically proven solution to their chronic health struggle exists, but they can't have it because the factory can't make the glass syringes fast enough, or the insurance just refuses to pay for it, they're going to find another way. And this is where our story shifts from a traditional pharmaceutical narrative to a consumer technology and regulatory narrative. Enter the telehealth platforms. Companies like Hims & Hers, Norm, and Ro, this platform practically overnight built massive, highly profitable parallel supply chains by offering compounded GLP-1 during the shortage. The specific FDA regulation that govern compounding, namely sections 503A and 503B of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. 503A refers to traditional compounding pharmacies. They are legally permitted to order or mix ingredients for a specific individual patient based on a specific prescription. On the federal level, when a commercial drug is officially listed by the FDA as being a shortage, compounding pharmacies are granted a legal exemption. They're permitted to produce essentially a copy of that commercial drug to ensure patients can still get medical care during the supply chain failure. So as long as the drug is on that shortage list, the compounding of the active pharmaceutical ingredient is perfectly legal. The telehealth platforms totally utilize this exemption to bypass the traditional pharmaceutical pricing structure. When branded drugs cost over 1,000 amounts if insurance denies, these telehealth platforms were prescribing and shipping compounded semaglutide and tirzepatide for 200 to 400 a month, which is a massive price arbitrage. It proved that when the traditional gatekeepers, the health insurance, the PBMs, the retail pharmacies, when they fail to provide access, patients are entirely willing to step outside the system, and the employee's health plan is bound by complex contracts, prior authorization requirements, and PBM rebate negotiations. The telehealth app simply ignores all of the architecture. It connects the patient, the prescriber, and the compounding pharmacy in a strict, unobstructed line. However, compounding boom was always living on borrowed time, because the legal exemption only exists as long as the FDA officially declares a shortage. The compounding window is tied entirely to the supply chain of the brand name manufacturers. So once Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk processed billions of dollars of new factory capacity online, the supply began to stabilize. The FDA evaluated the market and began clearing the shortage list. They declared the tirzepatide shortage resolved in late 2024 and semaglutide following in early 2025. And the moment that official status changed, the enforcement hammer came down. The FDA issued strict guidelines that the compounding of those specific molecules must cease immediately, which forced the telehealth platforms into a massive strategic pivot. By March 2026, companies like Hims & Hers completely phased out their compounded GLP-1 offerings and announced direct partnerships with the branded manufacturers like Novo Nordisk. The telehealth companies realized the regulatory window was snapshot, but they also knew they had aggregated millions of highly motivated consumers. Instead of fighting the pharmaceutical giants, they essentially became high-tech, frictionless distribution nodes for them. They pivoted from being a parallel supply chain to basically became the front door for the traditional supply chain. And this brings us to the next massive systematic issue. Because once the shortage ended, then patient was forced to go back to the traditional branded drugs. They slammed right back into a harsh reality of U.S. healthcare financing, which is that the word covered doesn't actually mean accessible. According to the Employee Benefit Service, throughout 2024 and 2025, a significantly higher percentage of employers officially added GLP-1 coverage for weight loss to their health plans. Despite the expanded coverage, only 11.2% of patients with an official obesity diagnosis actually received a prescription. Data shows that if a patient receives a first-time prescription for GLP-1 with a diagnostic code for type 2 diabetes, that prescription is filled within 60 days, 75% of the time. But if a patient receives a first-time prescription for that exact same GLP-1, but the diagnosis code is for obesity, only 32% of these prescriptions are filled in that same 60-day window. We have the exact same molecule, the same product, but if my doctor writes the code for obesity, I have less than a 1/3 chance. How does an insurance company functionally stop a doctor's prescription from reaching the patient 2/3 of the time? Well, they do it through utilization management, as we discussed in episode 4. They have several specific tools to deploy this friction, and the first tool is a prior authorization. The doctor must submit a comprehensive clinical dossier to the insurance company proving that the patient meets a highly restricted set of criteria before the insurer agrees to pay. For GLP-1, it often means documenting a specific BMI threshold, usually over 30 or over 27, with severe comorbidities like hypertension. And it often requires the doctor to submit logs proving the patient has engaged a documented supervised diet and exercise program for 3 to 6 months and still failed to lose weight. And if the doctor actually managed to get all the paperwork faxed and approved through the portal, the patient might then run into a second tool, step therapy. Step therapy requires the patient to literally fill on an order cheaper medication before the health plan will cover the newer, more expensive breakthrough drug. So, in the context of obesity, an insurance company might require a patient to first take a drug like phentermine, which is an older, cheaper generic stimulant, which seems counterproductive for a patient who likely already has cardiovascular risk factors. So the patient has to physically endure the failure of the cheaper alternative to earn the right to effective treatment. And even if you survive the prior authorization guideline and you suffer through the step therapy, there's a third tool, hard duration limits. Many employer health plans are placing explicit caps on how long they will pay for the drug, often limited coverage to 12 to 24 months. Obesity and metabolic dysfunction are chronic diseases. The GLP-1 is not a cure, it is a treatment. It replaces or supplements a hormone signal that the patient's body is not adequately producing or processing on its own. If you withdraw the medication after 12 months, the biology drivers of the disease just return. The gastric emptying speeds back up. The satiety signals vanish, the appetite returns, and the weight comes right back. It is basically like an insurance company paying for blood pressure medication for a year, and once your blood pressure is normal, they say, "Great, you're cured, we're stopping coverage." Medically, it is absurd, but financially, for a health plan that operates on an annual budget, it makes sense. The duration limit is simply a mechanism to cap their total financial liability for a single patient. Imagine two people working at this exact same company. They're on the exact same employer-sponsored health plan. They both have the exact same BMI of 33. Patient Wei has a documented diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. He goes to an endocrinologist, gets a prescription for Mounjaro. The prescription goes to the pharmacy because the diagnosis code is diabetes. The prior authorization is basically an automatic formality. The health plan proves it immediately, and he has his medication in hand within a week for a manageable copay. Now, patient B has severe prediabetics and obesity. Her A1C blood sugar levels are elevated, but she hasn't quite crossed the arbitrary clinical line into full-blown type 2 diabetes yet. She goes to her doctor and gets a prescription for Zepbound. Now, Zepbound and Mounjaro are the exact same active molecule, tirzepatide, made by the exact same company. But because her diagnosis code is obesity, her insurance denies the claim outright. They mandate 3 months of a documented diet program. She does it, her doctor fills in pill, the insurance denies it again, citing an explicit exclusion for weight loss therapies. And after 6 months of fighting her own health plan, she gives up and ends up paying out of pocket to a telehealth service. This example synthesizes the reality of U.S. healthcare access. Coverage is highly conditional and it is entirely divorced from biological reality. The system has structurally decided that treating metabolic dysfunction when it reaches the catastrophic stage of diabetes is financially necessary. Treating the exact same biologic dysfunction upstream when it's classified as obesity or prediabetes is viewed as elective or at the very least subject to extreme administrative rationing, which is widely different from how international health systems are attempt to manage the exact same scientific breakthrough. France, for example, took a completely different path than the US commercial market starting in June 2026. They became the first EU country to officially reimburse GLP-1s specifically for obesity, covering between 65 to 100% of the cost for eligible patients. They treated it as a standard medical intervention. And the UK took a different approach. The National Health Service, the NHS, recognized that they couldn't afford to instantly give the drug to every single citizen who wants it. But they didn't rely on hidden administrative friction to deny people. The NHS managed the capacity and budget constraints through transparent clinical triaging. They implemented a phased rollout, explicitly prioritizing roughly 220,000 of their highest risk patients first. They look at the data, identify the patient with the most severe comorbidities who would benefit the most quickly, and provided the drug to them with a plan to slowly expand access over a 12-year implementation cycle. It is rationally by science, not by bureaucracy. And meanwhile, back in the US, we have this massive structural barrier called the Medicare statutory exclusion. This is a federal law passed in the early 2000s, and that literally prohibits traditional Medicare from covering any drugs prescribed specifically for weight loss. The law treats obesity medication as if they are cosmetic lifestyle drugs, along things like hair loss treatments. While Medicare is the federal insurer for the elderly population, which is the exact same population that is at most risk for catastrophic, expensive downstream cardiovascular events caused by a lifetime obesity. Yet, the federal government is legally barred from paying for the upstream medication that prevents those catastrophic events. Now, CMS plans to launch a balance model in July 2026. The balance model is a pilot program from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. It is meant to act as a bridge, testing ways to provide some GLP-1 access and wraparound care outside the standard Medicare Part D pharmacy benefit. But we must be clear, it is a pilot program. It is a workaround. It is not a structural legislative fix to the underlying law. To really understand who is deciding the formulary, we need to go back to gatekeepers, big three PBMs, CVS, Caremark, TrumpRx, and Express Scripts, which control roughly 80% of the entire US prescription drug market. They are the architects of the formulary, the official list of which drugs an insurance plan will cover and on what tier. And it is driven heavily and sometimes entirely by the rebate game. This dynamic means that the pharmaceutical manufacturers are constantly competing not just on clinical efficacy, but on the sheer size of the rebate they can offer the PBM. The larger the rebate, the more financially attractive the drug is to the PBM. This is part of the recent CVS Caremark move matters. Caremark had previously excluded the bond from some standard formularies while favoring Wegovy. Then it changed course. The bond was added back as an additional preferred option effective October 1st, and Lilly's own oral obesity drug, Fundile, were added earlier, effective June 1st. And patient gets hit hard. The patient doesn't see the rebate at the point of sale, so they are subsidizing the rebate that the PBM and the employer are collecting behind the scenes. The whole system is entirely optimized for these opaque backroom financial flows at the point of sale affordability for the end user. And the PBM enforces this system using the exact utilization management tools we discussed earlier to legally steer patients towards a specific drug that offers the best rebate economics for the PBM. Regardlessly of whether a slightly different molecule might actually be marginally better for the specific patient's biology, the PBMs are the architects of the fiction, but we also have to acknowledge that they're executing the strategy on behalf of employers. And employers in the US are facing a financial threat from the specific class of drug. For some mid-sized and large companies, GLP-1 is now represent over 10% of their entire annual pharmacy claim spend. We're talking about 12,000 to 15,000 per patient annually for the branded drugs. If you are a self-insured employer, meaning the company itself pays the medical claims outside its own revenue, rather than paying premiums to a separate insurance company, that is staggering new line item. Imagine a company with 5,000 employees. If even 10% of the workforce goes on branded GLP-1, adding over $6 million to the company's annual operating expenses practically overnight. Employers trying to deploy some defense strategies like implementing strict annual spending caps for weight loss medications or segmenting the risk score by creating optional separate riders, which means that if an employee wants GLP-1 coverage, they have to explicitly opt in and pay a significantly higher monthly premium out of their own paycheck, effectively isolating the cost so the rest of the employee base doesn't subsidize it. We are also seeing the creation of novel financial hedging products in the benefit design market. For example, Cigna launched a program that offered a fixed percentage cost cap. They essentially guarantee an employee that their total GLP-1 spend will not increase by more than a certain threshold, saying 15% year over year. The insurer absorbs the risk beyond that. As our healthcare financing is optimized entirely for short-term annual corporate budget and episodic acute care, it is functionally incapable of financing long-term chronic disease prevention. The system is inherently fragmented. People change jobs, they switch insurance carriers during open enrollment, eventually they age out of commercial insurance entirely and go into Medicare. So the insurer rules the patient before they see the payoff. The financial incentive for any single commercial payer in the current moment is always to just push the cost down the road. It is a massive systematic misalignment of incentives. So the patient experience depends on a chain of decision that most patients never see. The manufacturer negotiates, the PBM designs a formulary, the employee chooses the benefit, the plan applies utilization management, the pharmacy checks coverage, the patient finds out at the counter. That is why GLP-1 access feels so inconsistent. It is not one decision, it is a sequence, and every step can narrow the path. If insurance said no, the patient could technically pay out of pocket, but for a drug price over $1,000 a month, that was not a real option for most people. So historically, for expensive branded drugs, insurance was the center of access. GLP-1 started to change that. As compounding grew, manufacturers saw that what was happening. Patients were willing to pay hundreds of dollars a month outside insurance. They were not waiting for PBM coverage. They were not waiting for employers to redesign the benefit. They were not waiting for Congress that created pressure. If compounded semaglutide or tirzepatide could reach patients at a lower cash price, branded manufacturers had to respond, not only through supply, but through manufacturer direct programs, telehealth partnerships, discount self-pay options, Lilly Direct, NovaCare, TrumpRx, pharmacy delivery, and online checkout. These are not random side channels. They are becoming part of the access architecture. The old model said, first get insurance coverage, then fill at the pharmacy. The emergent model is more fragmented. Try insurance. If insurance blocks you, try manufacturer cash pay. If the pharmacy is hard to navigate, try direct platform. If the employer drops coverage, look at TrumpRx or manufacturer side. If you still cannot afford it, you may simply be left out. And this is a different world. The Cigna gave us a clear example. Cigna said it would stop covering GLP-1 weight loss drugs, including Wegovy and Zepbound, for its own employees starting July 1st, 2026, while continuing coverage for type 2 diabetes. Employees were directed toward manufacturer cash pay options, or TrumpRx, and those purchases wouldn't count toward deductibles. That example matters because Cigna is not just any employer. It is one of the companies that understands this system from the inside. It owns Evernorth, it owns Express Scripts, it knows PBMs and employer benefits, it knows cost trend. So when Cigna makes that decision for its own workforce, the signal is not the drug doesn't work. The signal is the benefit model cannot easily absorb weight loss GLP-1 coverage at scale. And the cash pay route becomes a compromise. The company is not saying there's no path, it is saying not through the core health plan. And that is a very important distinction. Because once the access pathway moves outside the health plan, the risk pool changes. Insurance is supposed to pool cost across many people. Cash pay doesn't do that. Cash pay turns access into an individual purchasing decision. For some people, this is better. The price might be clear and faster, the paperwork might disappear. A patient who can afford $300 or $400 a month may prefer a predictable cash route over weeks of prior authorization. And recent reporting has described a growing discounted cash market for GLP-1s, with options becoming cheaper and easier to buy as manufacturers and consumer platforms respond to demand and compounding competition. And we should be honest about what cash pay couldn't absorb. It couldn't solve affordability for everyone. It couldn't create universal access. It doesn't protect patients who already pay premiums but still cannot get coverage. And in the Cigna case, if cash pay purchases don't count toward deductibles, the patient is paying outside the health plan entirely. That matters. The money spent on the drug doesn't help them reach the threshold, while insurance starts offering more protection. So cash pay can feel like access. It can also feel like abandonment. That duality is the whole story. For the patient who can afford it, cash pay is a relief. For the patient who cannot, cash pay is just another door with a price tag. TrumpRx sat inside that the same tension. The idea of TrumpRx is to create a government-linked prescription drug marketplace that points patients toward discounted drug purchase options. For GLP-1s, that matters because insurance coverage for weight loss remains inconsistent and many patients are already looking outside the traditional benefit. Has noted that TrumpRx adds another visible route into a growing drug pay market for these drugs. When a drug category becomes this large and this demanded, the system starts building new doors around the old ones. The manufacturer builds a door, the telehealth company builds a door, the government builds a door, the employer may close one door and point employee toward another. That tells us something about where healthcare is going. Access is becoming less linear. We're innovating at the speed of modern biology, but we are financing and distributing those innovations at the speed of mid-century bureaucracy. Every 6 months, a new clinical trial published data shows these drugs can fix another massive systematic health issue. And the system doesn't change. The underlying PBM rebate models, the employee turnover dynamics, the Medicare statutory exclusions, they haven't changed a lot. Retatrutide might deliver 30% weight loss, clear out liver fat, and dramatically reduce cardiovascular risk. But it enters the market price at $1,500 a month and subjected to the exact same step therapy protocols, prior authorization protocols, and prior coverage exclusions as today's drugs. We haven't solved the population health crisis. So after all of that, let's go back to where this episode started. That patient at the pharmacy counter, she did what the system usually tells patients to do. She went to her doctor, talked about her risk factors, and got a prescription. She brought it to the pharmacy, and then she learned that the prescription was only the beginning. There was a supply question. Could the pharmacy actually get the drug? There was a coverage question. Would the plan pay for it? That was a prior question. Did her company choose to cover weight loss GLP-1s in the first place? There was a PBM question. Which drug was preferred? Which one required prior authorization? Which one sat behind a different set of rules? And then, if all of that failed, there was a cash pay question. Could she afford to go around insurance entirely? That is what makes GLP-1 such a useful window into healthcare. No single actor fully owns the answer. The manufacturer can make the drug, but it cannot guarantee coverage. The doctor can prescribe it, but cannot guarantee approval. The PBM can put it on formulary, but the employer still has to choose the benefit. The employer can cover it, but may not want to carry the long-term cost. The government can test new models, but policy moves slowly. And the patient is left trying to figure out which line is actually open. The science moved faster than the access model. Medicine found a way to move upstream toward obesity, metabolic risk, cardiovascular prevention, and maybe a broader view of chronic disease. But the financing system is still more comfortable downstream, where the disease is already expensive enough to fit neatly into a claim. A heart attack has a billing code. A hospitalization has a pathway. A bypass surgery has a payment model. A diabetic complication has a reimbursement logic. Prevention is harder, not because people don't value it, but because the cost shows up now. The benefit may show up years later, maybe for another employer, another insurer, or another public program entirely. So GLP-1 leaves us a practical question. When medicine works before the crisis happens, who pays for it? The question is still unsettled. And until it is, GLP-1 access will probably keep looking like what it looks like today, several overlapping routes, each with its own rules, prices, and friction. And this is a real-world GLP-1 story. The drug exists, the demand is real, the channels are multiplying, but the access model is still being built in real time. So the next time you hear about a new GLP-1 pill, a new formulary update, a new cash pay program, or a new coverage pilot, the question is not only whether the drug works, the question is which patients can actually reach it, and through which door. That is what happens when GLP-1 meets the real world. Thanks for listening. See you next time.